All right, folks, we're moving on, and I'm now at the top of page 46, and we're working on this next little try it out exercise, and the topic here is basically organizing your files and folders and stuff. Next thing we're going to do, as you guys might anticipate, is, okay, we just brought a CSS file in. It's probably not best practice to just throw it in the root of the project, especially if we're going to create projects with some complexity. So we're going to go ahead and add a new folder. So I'm going to go up to the root here. I'm going to right click on top of Site, add new folder, and I'm going to call it Styles with a capital S. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab this CSS file here and drag and drop it into that folder, like that. And that's considered good practice, kind of separate all the content out between the different types of things that you're doing. They want us to create another folder called Controls. So let's go ahead and do that. So once again, click on the root of the project, then give it a right click, add new folder, Controls with a capital C. And we're going to use these folders quite a bit as we're working. We're going to put a whole bunch of controls in that Controls folder as we move along. All right. We already did step number 4, which is take that CSS file and move it over. All right. And next, we're going to move on to this next section where we talk about working with web forms. Now, I'm going to be really careful about the terminology I use here because over time this has kind of evolved a little bit. And it used to be in the old days when we were working in this technology, we would create what we call web forms, which were based upon, if you guys learned traditional programming inside of Visual Studio, there you learn how to do Windows forms, right? The concept is basically that a lot of the things that we do with users and applications is we interact with them and we want them to interact. One of the major ways we have interaction with users on a web page is through forms. Whether it's a text field that we type in, or a button, or a slider, or a drag and drop field, or whatever it happens to be, we consider those all web forms. And then when we create those kind of pages, those are the pages that have the ASPX file extensions. And there's that one template I think that we explored where you can go ahead and create the web form page where it pre-builds the whole thing and puts a lot of those components in automatically. And there's going to be a little bit of a different view in terms of what goes into a web form. Now, what's fascinating here, he takes us over to look at that front-end master, which I have up on my screen right now. And I'm going to zoom in just ever so slightly so you can see it better and take a look at this code. Notice the obvious things, right? We notice that there's a HTML5 doc type, the HTML tags, the body tags, the head tags, the title tags, but we have that ASP stuff at the top. It's interesting that there's little yellow highlights on it, right? And I think I mentioned in that first chapter in last week that when we see those percent signs indicate that ASP code is inside these brackets. And if you scroll down a little bit further, you're going to see a different approach as well. Notice that right under the title tag on line 8, we have this little ASP prefix inside the bracketed tags, right? And this is special ASP scripting code. And it doesn't take a lot to figure it out. And if you've had PHP experience, you guys will probably get this a little bit faster than if you haven't. And basically what's happening here is we're creating a section of the page that is going to accept content from other pages. Now keep in mind, this is what we call a master page. What we're placing here, if I was to do a comparison to PHP, would be the equivalent of an include. It's not quite the same kind of syntax, but we are creating a content placeholder. You'll notice that there's a placeholder in the head section of the document, and there's a placeholder in the body section of the document. So that's telling you that from a page that we would create, we can insert code into the head section, and we can insert code into the content section coming from an individual page. So the master page itself is not a web page. It's the framework for a page. This is kind of a new concept for you guys. But this is really the power of this format. Because I can create a structure here and then just create the areas where the content changes. And if you think about how websites work, most common websites will have like standard navigation, and then you might have standard stuff at the bottom, standard stuff at the top and the sides, and in the middle is usually where the content changes. So really what we're doing here is we're setting up the area for that content to change, and then we will create subsequent pages that will be devoid of like the doc type. Why? Because they're in the master page. And then what we'll create is just the stuff that goes in between here. And then when you hit that page knows that it's got a master page, so it loads up the master, and it takes itself and inserts it into the content placeholders. So why do we do this? Because we're recognizing the fact that websites have repeating patterns, so why recreate that code over and over again? It's inefficient. So we're creating the framework into which we will interject the code to create the individual content. This can get pretty sophisticated. This is a really primitive master page, the basic one that is automatically created. The assumption is that the individual pages that you load up might have their own CSS files or their own JavaScript files or whatever that'll go in the head section, and clearly they'll have their own content. But the stuff that can be repeated here will be repeated. I also want you to pay attention to the fact that because we are creating ASP.X pages, which are web form pages, we have a form tag into which basically all the page contents go into. Because we are expecting a certain level of dynamic interaction here that is done through forms. Forms are used in Windows applications. Forms are used in ASP.NET websites. All right. This next exercise is going to talk a little bit about this concept of placing a code file behind a page and then comparing it to doing code in line. So this is going to be one of our first pages that we're actually building. And in order to demonstrate this, we're going to start by actually building a new folder called demos. So let's go ahead and do that. Click on the root of your site, give it a right click, add a new folder, and then call it demos with a capital D. Next step, I'm actually going to move this over to my second screen. He wants us to right-click that demos folder, and then we're going to add a new item. And I want you to notice this dialog too, and I'm going to kind of explain that a lot of these dialog boxes are both based upon what you've previously done and the context in which you're taking the action. So in this case, because I'm on a folder and I say add new item, I can go to a whole list of different items. But notice at the bottom how there's a whole listing of what might typically go into like some folder, including a web form, a user control, JavaScript, style sheet, master page. So in some cases, if you know you're building a web form, for example, you can just select that and be done with it. It will automatically put the code file in a code behind, so it'll attach to the file. That happens automatically. If we choose the add new item like they're asking, we want to make sure that we're in Visual C#. The kind of page that they want us to choose is web form, and they want us to name it code behind. So code behind. Now if you happen, when you're typing in the file name here, you happen to blow away the .aspx, and you just type code behind it, will add it automatically. So you'll be okay. All right. Make sure that the checkbox for place code in separate file is selected, and it is.
What page are you working from?
We are on page 50 of the text, on step number 2. All right. When you're all done and you click Add, it's going to open up the page. Now notice, it's building out the whole page. It gives us the basic structure. Notice how this is different than the master page, though. It does not have the content placeholders. And if we were using the master page as our master page, we wouldn't have most of this stuff here. We are not doing that at this point. That's not the point of the demonstration. All right, next step. He wants us to switch over to design view, and this is something that's pretty important to know as a web designer, that right now we're looking at source code, and you guys recognize that we're looking at code. If you use the tool like Dreamweaver, which we were talking about last week a little bit, and Dreamweaver, the reason web designers love to use it is because of its visual. Like, I can switch over to design mode and click the live view button, and it shows me exactly what it looks like in a browser. Here we have design view, and I'm switching over to it, which they want us to do, and that's not at all what it's going to look like, right? It's indicating to us that it's a blank page. Thank you very much. And then you notice that the cursor's already inside there, and you can see that right here on top of it, it's got what place we're sitting within our document. So it's going to indicate where, like, what HTML structure we're sitting within, where our cursor is placed. Now sometimes we use the design view very simply because it's a quicker way to get stuff entered into the document than using the code view. And really what's going to happen here is we're just going to be entering text. All right, so I want you to be aware of you know, what mode you're in. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you're in source code mode or design mode, but you can also do split mode where you're looking at both at the same time. That's kind of cool. I like that one too. Right now they want us to be in straight up design mode. Your cursor is automatically going to be in here. Now I'm noticing that my cursor moved. Yeah, now it says div instead of body. I hope that's not too much of a problem. We'll find out.
He says that's what it's supposed to be.
Is that what it says? The dashed rectangle represents the div element you saw in markup view. Okay, well I guess so. All right, so I'm on step number 4. From the toolbox. Now, if you guys notice, you guys should have your toolbox either appearing in the environment or, like mine, it's collapsed on the side. And I can click it and expand it. However, if you're not seeing it at all, what you want to do is you want to, and see I have to demonstrate it of course, go to the View menu and then find Toolbox and then bring that up. You might even want to pin it into place, and then you also want to come over here and then click on the very first category, which is Standard. And notice that you got all these different things you can just drag and drop right into your project instead of hand coding. The first thing they want us to drag and drop in is a label. So here I'm going to find label on the list, and then I'm just going to drag and drop and put it directly inside that box. Okay?
Hey guys, I'm starting over. Don't worry about me. It's fine.
All right. So now that you have that placed in, we are now going to jump into the code view. Now, one way you can get directly into the code view from the design view is you can just double click anywhere in the document, but not on top of an object. So like, not up here, come down here where there's nothing and just give it a double click. And what that does is it opens up the code behind file. So if you look at the Solution Explorer on the right, we do have the page that we created, and of course you have a little expando box with the C# file. So by doing that double click, it drops us right into the C# file. Okay. Oh no, we're learning a new programming language. and we haven't done everything like learn about data types and like conventions for the language, here's what I'm going to tell you, right? You guys have all had Java 1? A long time ago. Okay, don't freak out. It's just like Java with a couple of differences, okay? Notice that at the top of the document, we have a bunch of using statements. What does that compare to Java, would you guess? Import, right? They created C# and they said, oh, we can't do what Java does. Let's call it using. You know? All right, so they're using a bunch of different libraries that are default for this project type. You can add stuff manually or automatically, but this is generated automatically just based on our template type. Also notice that we have the class file, and notice it says public partial class, demos, code behind. That's all named automatically. We didn't choose it. It just happened. And that it also basically extends, that little colon, extends a system library called System Web User Interface Page, right? You don't need to memorize any of that stuff. The stuff is always going to be automatically generated. You're never going to be in the situation, or really you shouldn't be in the situation where you're typing it in manually unless you kind of accidentally delete it or something, okay? Then on top of it, inside that class file, which is basically the programming code we're adding, there's another method inside there called page load. What do you suppose that does?
Load the page.
Well, no, it doesn't load the page. Whatever code goes inside here triggers when the page loads. So if I wanted to run programming code right when the page loads up, I put it inside that set of curly brackets. Then I can also create my own class files or methods that go inside of this and write code. Now, I know we haven't learned anything about the language yet, but they're going to give us the code. And in fact, in step number 5, I'm going to pull it over, he's got some code. And depending on which language you're working in, you're going to copy that code. So what we're going to do here is we are going to be working with C#. So if you're working in C#, we're going to work with the page load code. And it says double click somewhere in the white area below the div element. We did that. It opened up the code view, and then we're looking for this method to add our code. What are we going to add? The text in bold. So I'm going to come down here. I'm just going to grab it. I'm grabbing it right from the PDF. You want to type it? Type it. Whatever you want to grab it from the author's zip file code, do that. That's fine. Doesn't matter how, just get it in there. So let's copy that. Go back to the IDE and just paste it in. And then let's talk about what it's doing, because it's really not that hard to figure out. So the first thing we're doing is, it says here label1.text. Now I'm going to jump back over to the ASPX page, and I'm going to notice that I dragged in a label, right? It was an object that I just pulled in from the toolbox, and I put it right in my code. Well, actually, not into my code, into my design view. But if I do switch over to the source code view, or maybe better yet, let's just do split screen, you'll notice that the label that was dropped in was put in with ASP tags in front of it. Of objects, so it's an ASP object called label. It automatically gives it an ID, and then it gives it a directive to run at the server, so it has to run server side, and then it has a label and the text which says label, right? So if I put it up on the screen, it's just going to print out, like I run the web page, it's just going to print out label. What we're doing in the C# file is we're saying that that object whose ID is label 1, the text property of that object is now equivalent to this string. Hello world, the time is now, and what do you suppose the plus sign does? Math? Concatenate, right? You guys know what concatenate is. And then it runs some system method. I'm not asking you to memorize them. You know, there'll be some they'll memorize over time, but like most programmers, we just look them up when we need them.
I'm froze.
Date, time, now to string.
Froze out.
So what does that do?
Two machines.
Press the date.
Yeah, the date and time, that's a built-in function, method. What time? Now, and it converts it to a string. So what is this going to do? It's going to say, hello world, the time is now, whatever time it is, and it's going to replace the text that's here. That's pretty cool. It really is. Very simplistic, but very cool and very powerful.
Are you free to change the ID to tag the name?
You can change it. And in fact, if you start changing it, the debugger, the on-the-fly debugger here, like if I went in here and I changed this to label instead of label 1, it's going to underline. It's going to say it doesn't match up with anything on your document. What are you doing? And if I changed it on the ASPX page, it would do the same thing.
My class is named Demos Default.
Okay. Version differences of Visual Studio.
I'm surprised it didn't make it over that.
Yeah, in the older versions of Visual Studio, it would just call it public class demos. But they've gotten, the tools evolve. So if it says something different, doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It's a version difference.
Are you
So-
working from a different version from this? You are, aren't you?
Yes, the book is 2012. We're working in 2017. That's a full 3 versions down.
Okay.
So,
Uh,
all right,
both
let's
these machines are frozen.
let's go on to the next step. Now, what's fascinating here, folks, is one thing that the author is doing in the instructions, and I have them up on the screen, is notice he's advising, obviously, that you type this in, right? And the reason he's doing that is so that you can see, and what he's trying to tell you is, like, if I type label, begin typing it, the auto, or the IntelliSense is what they call it in this tool, will go ahead and find the component, and then you can actually go in here and just double click it, and it'll type it in automatically for you. In fact, it can be very anticipatory with all your keystrokes, and if you get fast with this tool, you can, with very little typing and a few mouse clicks, build these components very quickly. Okay? I'm copy pasting because I'm trying to save time here in class, but if you're following along and you're typing in, you can just literally do this, and you see what I'm doing. I'm just typing, and then it narrows down the selection, and I press enter once it's highlighted. Pretty cool. Yes, it goes to your web page. It realizes what tools and components you've added, and as you're typing, it finds them and automatically helps you type them in. Thank you, Bill Gates, or whoever actually created this. Probably not Bill Gates. All right. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and we're going to launch this. So we are going to come over here to the Solution Explorer. We don't want to just hit the play button, okay, because the application's not configured that way. But we are going to click on the code behind ASPX file, so the actual web page file. We're going to right click it, and then we're going to view in browser. Right now I'm noticing that mine's set for Firefox. Yours might be set for Chrome, Internet Explorer, whatever. It's going to choose whatever the default is up here. If you want to launch it into a different browser, you can hit this little drop down and choose whatever your default is, and that's what will appear on the button here. But right now I'm going to right click this and then view in browser. And what that's going to do automatically, it's going to save your pages if you haven't saved them already, and then it's going to launch the internal web server in Visual Studio, and then it's going to execute your page. From a conceptual standpoint, what just happened here, folks, is it loaded up this page. The page had code behind that triggered on page load that took whatever was in the label text, changed the text, ran a function to pull in the system time, and then converted it all to a string and put it up on the page. Without a server-side component, this would not work. HTML cannot do this on its own. Okay, so this is server-side ASP.NET. Unfortunately, we are at the point where we are out of time tonight. And in fact, we're well past the end of class. Makes me wish the class was 4 hours long. But we will pick up with this stuff next week. So I encourage you guys to please feel free to work ahead on your own and complete the stuff. You can work ahead as far as you want. You know, if you're done with all the stuff that's in the units that are already released, which are units 1, 2, and 3, chapters 1, 2, and 3, move on to chapter 4 because that's where we're going to go next. We're just going to march through the book sequentially.
So all the try it out.
All the try it out exercises in each one of the chapters.
And does from here on out you continue to build this on the same thing?
For the most part, we are building on the same structure. There's a couple times when we deviate to introduce where you start building your own project and building your own stuff. And that's, I think that's where it really gets fun, because when you start to put your own creativity into it, once you learn the tools. All right, everybody, have a good night, and I'll see you next week.